bless that man. I can't tell you. It's not always a given that someone writes a whole bunch of amazing books and is super famous and also really, really kind. But there you have it. And when Rick chose my story for Best American, it was such a thrill, and it was especially a thrill to be chosen by a writer whose books I love, and my family passes them around. So thank you. Clearly that is the more exciting tent. I don't know what's going on over there. Maybe we should all go there. But thank you for coming and for closing down the show with me. Seating Arrangement was my first novel, and it started as a short story that I wrote my first semester of graduate school, which was 7 years ago. And it was about a man on an island preparing for the wedding of his daughter, and he's hit by a golf cart, and he cooked lobsters, and he gave his daughter away on her wedding day. And it was sort of inspired by a friend of mine getting hit by a golf cart on Nantucket. It didn't really work as a story, and I workshopped it twice, and it's just this blatant John Cheever knockoff. And my teacher said, well, maybe it should be a novella. Maybe there's too much here. And now that I've taught, I know that that's something you say just to be nice and when you don't have a solution. But I sort of thought, clearly the world is hungry for more about this man, and I need to do this. But I kind of knew I wasn't ready to write a novel. I was really inexperienced. And for me, the best way to take advantage of workshop was to workshop short stories. And you're always responsible for a beginning, a middle, and an end twice a semester. So I sort of put it aside in my head that I would expand the story into a novel. And 2 years later, when I was done with my MFA, I had my little tiny fellowship. I had some savings. And so I went to Nantucket for 8 months, the 8 months between October 1st and June 1st. Just not the high season. And I wrote the whole first draft of Seating Arrangements while I was there. And really what made me commit to it as a novel was the chemistry I felt with this character, Win Van Meter, who's the father of the bride. He has been described by many people as unlikable, but I love him, and that's why I want to spend time with him. I'm just going to read the first 3 pages of the book, and then I'll skip ahead and read a different section, and then we can all go enjoy the beach, or I'll do questions, and then we can do that. So this is the very beginning. By Sunday, the wedding would be over, and for that, Win Van Meter was grateful. It was Thursday. He woke early, alone in his Connecticut house, a few late stars still burning above the treetops. His wife and 2 daughters were already on Waskeke, in the island house, and as he came swimming up out of sleep, he thought of them in their beds there, Biddy keeping to her side, his daughter's hair fanned over their pillows. But first he thought of a different girl, or barely thought of her. She was a bubble bursting on the surface of a dream, who was also asleep on Waskeke. She would be in one of the brass guest beds up on the 3rd floor under the eaves. She was one of his daughter's bridesmaids. Most mornings, Win's entries into the waking world were prompt, his torso canting up from the sheets like the mast of a righted sailboat. But on this day, he turned off his alarm clock before it could ring, and stretched his limbs out to the bed's 4 corners. The room was silent, purple, and dim. By nature, he disapproved of lying around. Lost time could not be regained, nor missed mornings stored up for later for later use. Each day was a platform for accomplishment. Up with the sun, he had told his daughters when they were children, whipping off their covers with a flourish and exposing them lying curled like shrimp on their mattresses. Now Daphne was a bride, a pregnant bride, no point in pretending otherwise, and Livia, her younger sister, the maid of honor. The girls and their mother were spending the whole week on the island with an ever-multiplying bunch of bridesmaids and relatives and future in-laws, but he had decided he could not manage so much time away from work, which was true enough. A whole week on the matrimonial front lines would be intolerable, and furthermore, he had no wish to confirm that the bank would rumble on without him, his absence scarcely noticed except by the pin-striped young sharks who had begun circling his desk with growing determination. He switched on the lamp. The windows went black, the room yellow. His jaundiced reflection erased the stars and trees, and he felt a twinge of regret at how lamplight obliterated the pre-dawn world, turning it not into day but night. Still, he prided himself on being a practical person, not a poetic soul vulnerable to starlight and sleep fuzz, and he reached for his glasses and swung his feet to the floor. Before going to bed, he had laid out his traveling clothes, and when he emerged from the shower, freshly shaven and smelling of bay rum, he dressed efficiently and trotted downstairs, flipping on more lights as he went. He had packed Biddy's Grand Cherokee the night before, fitting everything together with geometric precision, all the items forgotten and requested by the women, plus bags and boxes of groceries, clothes for himself, and sundry wedding odds and ends. While the coffee brewed, he went outside with the inventory he was keeping on a yellow legal pad and began his final check. He rifled through a row of grocery bags in the back seat and opened the driver's door to check for his phone charger, his road atlas, even though he could drive the route with his eyes closed, and a roll of quarters, crossing each off the list in turn. Garment bags and duffels stuffed to fatness made a bulwark in the back, and he had to stand on tiptoe and lean into the narrow pocket of air between them and the roof to confirm the presence, in the middle of it all, of a glossy white box the size of a child's coffin that held Daphne's wedding dress. "Don't forget the dress, Daddy," the answering machine had warned in his daughter's voice the previous night. "Here, Mom wants to say something." "Don't forget the dress, Win," said Betty. "I won't forget the damn dress," Win had told the plastic box. He crossed dress off the list and slammed the back hatch. Birds were calling, and yellow light bled through the morning haze, touching the grassy undulations and low stone wall of his neighbor's estate. Strolling down the driveway to retrieve his newspaper from a puddle, he noticed a few stones that had fallen from the wall onto the shoulder of the road, and he crossed over to restore them, shaking droplets from the journal's plastic sack as he went. The hollow sound of stone on stone was pleasant, and when the repair was done, he stood for a minute stretching his back and admiring the neat Yankee face of his house. Nothing flashy or new would ever tempt him away from this quiet neighborhood inhabited by quality people. The houses might be large, but they were tastefully shrouded by trees, and many, like his, were full of thin carpets and creaking aristocratic floors. His Connecticut house was home, and his house on Waskeke was also home, but a home that was familiar without losing its novelty, the way he imagined he might feel about a long-term mistress. Waskeke was the great refuge of his life, where his family was most sturdy and harmonious. To have all these people, these wedding guests, invading his private domain rankled him, though he could scarcely have forbidden Daphne from marrying on the island. She would have argued that the island was her island, too, and she would have said Waskeke's pleasures should be shared. He wished that the ferry could take him back into the world where the girls were still children, and just the four of them would be on Waskeke. The problem was not that he wasn't pleased for Daphne, he was, or that he did not appreciate the ceremonial importance of handing her into another man's keeping, he did. He would carry out his role gladly, but the weekend, now surveyed from its near edge, felt daunting, not a straightforward exercise in familial peacekeeping and obligatory cheer, but a treacherous puzzle, full of opportunities for the wrong thing to be said or done. So I'll read from the beginning of the second chapter, which is actually a flashback sequence, and it's about Biddy telling Win that she's pregnant for the second time, and they already have one daughter, Daphne. Before he became a father, Win had assumed he would have sons. He had expected Daphne to be a boy, had lain with his ear against Biddy's pregnant belly, and heard male voices echoing down from future lacrosse games and ski trips. He saw a small blue blazer with brass buttons, short hair combed away from a straight part, himself teaching a boy to tie a necktie. He would drive his son to Harvard when the time came, and help him carry his bags through the yard, would greet his son's roommates and their fathers with hearty handshakes. His son would join the Ophidian Club, and Win would attend the initiation dinner and drink with the boy who would live his life over again, affirming its correctness at every juncture. When the screaming ham hock the doctor pulled from between Biddy's legs turned out to be unmistakably female, all crevices and puffiness, he felt a deep and essential surprise. Not only that the child brewing in his wife those 9 months was a girl, but that he, Wynne, possessed the seeds of a feminine anything. Inside the tangled pipes of his testicular factory, there existed, beyond all reason, women. Watching Biddy and Daphne nestle together in the hospital bed, he realized he had been mistaken to think that pregnancy and birth had something to do with him. He had imagined that by impregnating this woman, he had ensured she would deliver a son, who would go forth and someday impregnate another woman, who would, in turn, have a son, and so on and so forth down the Van Meter line into the misty future. But now, instead, there was this girl child who would grow breasts and take another man's name and sprout new branches on an unknown family tree and do all sorts of traitorous things a son would not do. The shifting and swelling of Biddy's boyish body into a collection of spheroids, the quiet communion she lavished on her belly, her new status with her sisters and covey of friends, all this should have told him he was standing at the threshold of a club that would not have him. Even though women held out their arms and exclaimed, "You're going to be a father," he suspected they had seen him all along for what he was, the adjunct, the contributor of additional reporting, the lame duck about to be displaced from the center of his wife's affections. The surprise should not have been that he had a daughter, but that any boys were ever born at all. When, 5 years later, Biddy announced she was pregnant for the second time, Wynne assumed from the first that the baby would be a girl. The deck was stacked, the game was rigged. Daphne was so staunchly female that the possibility of his and Biddy's genes being put back in the tumbler and coming out a boy seemed too small to bother with. Biddy gave him the news in bed in the morning, and he kissed her once, hard, and said, "Well," before going downstairs to sit behind the journal and think about a vasectomy. He was at the kitchen table, staring sightlessly at the pages, when he heard the rustling, tinkling sound that announced Daphne. She slid into a chair and sat eating red grapes out of a plastic bag. She wore a piece of crenellated, bejeweled plastic in her hair, and a cloud of pink gauze stood up where her skirt bent against the back of the chair. "Good morning, Daphne. Going to dance class today?" "No, that's on Wednesday." "Isn't that a dance skirt you're wearing?" "My tutu? I just threw this on." Wynne stared at her. She looked back at him and fingered one of the strands of plastic beads that garlanded her neck. Somehow in her infancy, she had absorbed a set of phrases and mannerisms that Biddy called breezy and Wynne called absurd, but that, in any event, had her swanning through preschool like an aging socialite. They left her once with Biddy's eldest sister, Tabitha, and went to Turks and Caicos for a week, hoping Tabitha's son Dryden would get her to dirty her knees a little. Instead, they returned to find Dryden draped in baubles, and Daphne arranging clips in his hair. "Dryden," Biddy said, "you look awfully dressed up for this time of day." The boy released a sigh of weary sophistication. He fluttered his blue-dusted eyelids and spread his fingers against his chest. "Oh, this? This is nothing. The good stuff's in the safe." To Wynne, Daphne was a foreign being, a sort of mystic, a snake charmer or a charismatic preacher, an ambassador from a distant frontier of experience. The academic knowledge that she was the product of his body was not enough to forge a true belief. He felt no instantaneous, involuntary recognition of her as flesh and blood, not for lack of trying either. He had changed her diapers and held her while she cried in the night and spooned gloopy food into her mouth, and certainly he loved her, but she only became more and more strange to him as she got older, and his love for her gave him no comfort, but instead made him alarmingly porous, full of hidden passageways that let in feelings of yearning and exclusion. Sitting behind the paper, he imagined with trepidation a house populated by 2 Daphnes, a Biddy, and only one Wynne. "Daddy," came the piping voice from across the table. "Am I a princess?" "No," Wynne said. "You're a very nice little girl." "Will I be a princess someday?" Wynne bent the top of the newspaper down and looked over it. "Depends on whom you marry." "What does that mean?" "Well, there are 2 ways for a woman to become a princess. Either she's born one, or she marries a prince, or I think a Grand Duke, although I'm not sure those exist anymore. You see, Daphne, many countries that used to have princesses don't anymore because they've abolished their monarchies, and an aristocracy doesn't make sense without a monarchy. Austria, for example, got rid of all that business after the First World War. Hereditary systems like that aren't fair, you see, and they breed resentment among the lower classes. Anyway, the long and short of it is, since you weren't born a princess, you would need to marry a prince, and there aren't very many of those around. Reproachfully, she ate a grape, and then wiped her fingers one at a time on a napkin. He returned to reading. Daddy. What? Am I your princess? Oh, Christ, Daphne. What? You sound like a kid on TV. Why? Because you're full of treacle. What's treacle? Something that's too sweet it gives you a stomachache. She nodded, accepting this. But she pressed on, am I your princess? To the best of my knowledge, I don't have any princesses. What I do have is a little girl without any dignity. What's dignity? Dignity is behaving the way you're supposed to so people respect you. Do princesses have dignity? Some do. Which ones? I don't know, maybe Grace Kelly. Who is she? She was a princess. First she was an actress, then she married a prince and became a princess in Monaco. She was killed in a car accident. What's Monaco? A place in Europe. Daphne took a moment to absorb and then asked, am I your princess? We've just been through this, Wynne said, exasperated. She looked like she was trying to decide whether her interests would be better served by smiling or crying. I want to be your princess, she said, teetering toward tears. Daphne was an accomplished crier, plaintive and capable of great stamina. For a girl so physically delicate and soft in voice, she was unexpectedly... I got distracted by an ant, sorry. She was unexpectedly stalwart in her emotions. Her tears were purposeful, as were her smiles and pouts. Beatty called her Lady Macbeth. Ducking back behind his paper, Wynne did what was necessary. All right, he said, Daphne, you are my princess. Really? Absolutely. Daphne nodded and ate a grape. Then she cocked her head to one side. Am I your fairy princess? And I'll stop there. As I was walking over here, this little kid in sunglasses was like, are you a book author? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, what books have you written? And I was like, this one. And he goes, is that all you've written? I was like, yeah. So if anyone has any questions, I'm at your service.
I've been fascinated listening to other authors talk about how long it has taken.
Sorry.
How's this?
I've been fascinated listening to other authors talk about how long it has taken them to complete their books and how they know or don't know or hope that 1 year, 2 year, 5 years into it that there's still something there as opposed to what I think a lot of people would do after 1 week, say, this is crap. What keeps you going, and how do you know that that seed that started as one story was actually worth turning into something else?
Mm-hmm. I mean, in the case of seating arrangements, in a way it was kind of blind faith. And this was the first thing, like, I've written not a ton of short stories, but I don't know, 15 maybe. And usually when I'm done with a story, if someone says, write another scene, I'm like, I can't, I'm done with those people. And when the suggestion was made to expand seating arrangements, I just felt like a lot of doors had opened. I saw lots of things I wanted to say about this character. So for me, just going through that first draft, it was interest in this character and just wanting to spend more time with him. And there are also sort of set pieces I had in my head that I wanted to include in the book. Like at some point, a whale explodes, like a dead whale, like blows up. And that was something that I'd read about happening when I was a teenager, and I just like thought, well, I'm sure I'll be able to work that in somewhere. And so I just kind of kept writing, like looking for that moment where the whale would need to explode. But I have had the others, and so then, I did that draft and proudly showed it to my agent, like a cat bringing a dead bird or something, and she was like, no, 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 no. And so I spent maybe a year revising, and then it was 2 years between selling the book and when it came out. And in the meantime, I had a writing fellowship at Stanford, so I was still in workshop, and I wrote 100 pages of what I thought would be my second novel. And I also wrote another story that really didn't work, and it was about a ballet dancer. I'm not a dancer, but I really love ballet, and so when I kind of got stuck on this novel project, I was like, oh, I'll just be decadent and crazy and revise this short story. And it sort of spiraled out of control and became this 90-page thing, and then became 160 pages. And now that's actually my second novel, and which comes out in April. It's called Astonish Me. And so when I had the time, then I went back to the 100 pages, and I thought, now I'll really work on this. And it had just died. Like, I couldn't do it, and I think it had become too much of a concept. It was meant to be sort of a update of Mary McCarthy's novel, The Group, which has been updated by other novelists as well. And so I kind of spent a month, I was traveling and I had planned to work on it. I sort of spent that month abandoning that project. But I think that's the thing. It's sort of like you really need a strong spark at the beginning to sort of last the marathon, and it wasn't there with the other one. So I don't know. It's very mysterious.
What is it that you love about Win? How do you
I just feel sorry for him. He's so sort of misguided. I feel like he's trying to do the best he can within the framework with which he understands the world. Like, he thinks the world operates according to a very strict set of rules, and everyone should behave that way, and that he's obeying the rules, so he should be rewarded. And he's always trying to join these clubs, and he's just chasing this sensation of belonging. And of course, he should be looking for it perhaps within his own family. So I think he's sort of amusingly bumbling, but I also feel a lot of compassion for him. He's my friend.
Can you talk about structure
Sure.
and how that's developed through your career, what you've learned?
Yeah. With my short stories, I tend to be a lot more experimental with structure. I feel like writing a story in some way can be sort of like a laboratory experience or experiment where I'll try a different point of view, or I'll try some weird insertion of dialogue that's not grounded in anything. And I think committing to a strange structure within a short framework has sort of helped me become a little bit more daring in my novels. Although Seating Arrangements has a very straightforward structure. It's just these 2 days. And I think, too, for a first novel, I was making it a little bit more manageable for myself, where I didn't have to write a sprawling family epic. I really just had to get them through 48 hours. And then I could do flashbacks where I felt like it. My second novel covers about 30 years and is slightly shorter than Seating Arrangements, and it's in the present tense. It's about a dancer in the corps of like an American ballet theater, New York City Ballet, who helps a Soviet star defect. So the different sections are labeled with a place and a year, and the earliest one is 1972, and it takes place in New York, Paris, and Southern California. And the way I wrote it initially as a 90-page novella, the years were all shuffled, and each section would end with sort of a piece of, you'd be missing a piece of information, and then the next section would sort of answer that by changing year. And then as it got longer, that became really confusing. And the biggest thing that happened when my editor revised it was that she asked me to put it in a slightly more chronological order. And it's still a little bit out of order, and I feel like it lost a bit of the mysteriousness that I liked about it. But I suppose making it understandable for one's readers is probably fair trade. So I think for me it's been sort of coming to understand structure better has sort of involved diving into it in one way or another, and then sort of trying to implement what I learned. Trial and error.
We've had a lot of middle-aged authors, and we have some young authors, and I wondered if you felt that there was something that you specifically needed to get from people who've been through this process, because you're very young to have accomplished what you have, and I wondered what it was that you felt you could get from people who have been there before you.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I think you often feel like you know a writer by having read their work, like with Rick's novels, for example. And so I feel like I learned so much from reading people, and it can be a mixed bag when you meet them. Like, sometimes, they're mean, or they're not friendly, or they hit on you, or they just behave in these ways that are really disappointingly human. So some of the things I've learned my MFA was at Iowa, and then I was at Stanford for 2 years, and we'd always have all these incredibly famous people sort of cycle through and do readings, and then you'd have this sort of cocktail hour where you'd stand and hope you didn't have to talk to the famous person because you were afraid of them. And I think in some ways, a lot of what I've learned is things that I considered to be dangerous. I think if you if you have a big success, I've seen writers who have had a big success or several big successes, I think there can be a temptation to think that everything you write is solid gold, and if anyone criticizes it, they're wrong. And I think people can become really difficult to edit. And I've seen writers whose work I really admire, start to be disappointing, or you think you can see things in their work where they're gunning for some new level of acclaim. So I think that's been it's sort of irrelevant at this point, but just to sort of always feel like you can get better, and that every piece of writing can be better. Like, even after it's published, it's not it's not as good as it could be. It's probably not good enough. I feel like that just sort of like relentless rigor, and coupling that as much as possible with, letting go, and also trying to accept the fact that nothing's ever perfect. Like, there's no perfect novel that will please everybody and everyone will like every word of. And I think for me, I don't think I'm someone who has the patience to sort of struggle for 7 years with a book in the way some people do and then produce amazing books. I think I'm more of the stripe to be like, well, this is probably where it's going to be. So I don't know. Don't be mean, I guess, is the lesson I've learned. People won't like you.
And Maggie, you'll go over to the author panel.